Hello and welcome to this lecture which is on how to use the legislation, and what I'm thinking of here is how to use the legislation in your ATT and your CTA exams. Now you might find it useful whilst listening to this lecture to have your books in front of you so that as I mention things you can maybe look them up as we go along. So with the legislation, basically you will either be using the red and green books or you will be using the yellow and orange books. Some students also use HMSO's copies of the taxing statutes, but they're not as popular as the other two sets, although all are equally allowable in the exam itself. What's not allowed are the VAT handbooks and the tax handbooks themselves. You're only allowed the legislation in the exam. Now, for exams in 2014, you will be using the version 2013/14, which is all the legislation up to and including the Finance Act 2013. So here we are with the books in the exam, and we have to think about how these books can be useful to us. So first thing we need to think about is marking the legislation. Now, the books that you take into the exam can be underlined, they can be sidelined, and they can be highlighted. What you can't do is write anything in them, use post-it notes, tag the books in any way, so, you know, sort of bend down the pages in the corners, that sort of thing. The only thing you're allowed to do is write your name on the books. No other written material is permitted at all. So what you've got to say to yourself is, I need to be familiar with what's in these books. So how many volumes are there? What's in each of the volumes? What's in each of the books? Where are the contents? Where is the index? So all this will be helpful, useful to you in preparation for the exam. Now, CCH and Tolly's have basically got the same stuff in them. It's just they order their books in a different way. And the way that the books start off is they take the legislation chronologically in order. And so, for example, I'm looking at Part 1A, and you can see if you look down the sides of the books, you've got these grey blobs. In 1A, really the only grey blobs that are important, I would say, is the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act, which is the third one, and the final grey blob, which is the Capital Allowances Act. So what we're doing is we're working our way down through date order. In the next book, for Tolly's, that's 1B. You've got a TIPA, so that's 2003. You've then got a TOIA, 2005. You've then got the Income Taxes Act, 2007. And again, these are all shown with grey blobs at the side, and I think CCH do a similar sort of system. Then you go down into Book 1C, which has got your Corporation Tax Act and your international legislation. That's dealt with the main taxes, but we've also got inheritance tax, we've also got national insurance, VAT, stamp taxes. You just need to know where each of these taxes are in your particular legislation. And then also, as well as the acts, we have our statutory instruments, we have our other information, so statements of practice, HMRC briefs, really quite interesting stuff, which I'll have a look at one or two of these a little bit later in the talk. So 7 books for Tolly's. I think it's not far different for CCH. An awful lot of stuff in there, and you've got to be familiar with what's there, what's in each book. Now, what I would say to students is you just need to think about what it is you need to be using the legislation for. So if it's something to do with capital gains tax, then you know it's going to be in the the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act 92. If it's something to do with employees, then it's in a TIPA. So that's where we're going to get all our share schemes, our benefits, taxable benefits for employees. If it's something to do with a sole trader or a partnership, then it's a TOIA, so that's taxation of trading and other income. Hence, other income like property income, etc., is also in a TOIA. Capital allowances, obviously, it's in the Capital Allowances Act. if you are calculating income tax, then that's the Income Tax Act. So trading losses, how you deal with them, is actually in the Income Taxes Act because it affects the calculation of income tax. So this is where you get your rates, your personal allowances, that sort of thing. For companies, obviously we've got our two Corporation Tax Acts, and then we've also got our international legislation there as well. So if you can sort of pin down which act it is, then that's really useful in the exam itself. And within those acts, there's various bits of legislation you might want to have highlighted. So, for example, in the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act, we've got our various reliefs, rollover, incorporation, gift relief, entrepreneurs relief, and so on, principal private residence relief. We've also got some stuff in there about groups of companies. Then in your Capital Allowances Act, there's various bits and pieces that you'll want to have highlighted there, so the definition of plant and machinery in particular. Other key contents, of course, in a TIPA, you're going to want to have your benefits legislation highlighted, maybe definitely share schemes, conditions, etc. for share schemes. In a TOIA, of course, we're looking at our trading income, and then in the Income Taxes Act, we're looking at things that affect the calculation of income tax, so losses, EIS, VCT, that sort of thing. Two other areas of the legislation that I recommend you're definitely familiar with and is highlighted are where all the penalties are. Now, this isn't as easy to find because it's not one of these great big consolidated acts that's got a lovely grey blob down the side, but basically this is the Finance Act 08, Finance Act 09, and you've basically got to be able to find that and have highlighted the penalties there. Please don't be like one of my students who said, yes, I'm going to highlight these, Karen, I'm going to highlight these. Went into the exam, first question, 10 mark, question on penalties, went blank, couldn't remember where penalties were, hadn't highlighted them, didn't answer the exam question, and failed the complete exam by 1 mark. Please don't let that be you. So you just make sure you know where those two acts are in your particular books and you have highlighted them. We've got our Corporation Tax Acts as well. So I would say that these are the key contents that you really need to know which act, where these things are within the act itself. There is an index. There's two parts to the index. There's the normal index, and then there's what I call the noddy index, the simpler index, which in TOLI is called the words and phrases. In CCH is called the definitions and meanings. CCH has its own index book, but TOLI's, the index is at the very end of Book 1C for the main acts, and then, for example, it's at the end of Book 2, and then it's at the end of all the individual taxes, so at the end of national insurance, at the end of inheritance tax, at the end of VAT, etc. So the index is a little bit spread around in TOLI's. It's just in one nice big book for CCH. Can I just give you a little bit of a warning here? The index is not very good, not very helpful. You have to think laterally to use the index. It could save your bacon in a sticky situation, but I'm hoping that you won't have to resort to the index in the exam. What is much better, really, for you is knowing where everything is, where all the main acts are. And so when you're studying, study with your legislation nearby. And please don't start highlighting straight away. Think before you highlight. Consider what it is you need to highlight. How is it going to help you in the exam? How would it help me if I opened this up in the exam to highlight in a specific way? And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. What you really should be highlighting are things you just don't want to have to learn. So things like definitions, conditions, maybe time limits, that sort of thing. So what are the conditions for a share scheme? oh, I'm just going to look that one up and copy it out. Those are the sorts of things you should be highlighting. So think very carefully how it's going to be useful to you in a very time-pressured exam. I would say when you're highlighting something in the legislation, also highlight the contents page. So, for example, if we're highlighting something in a TIPA, some sort of taxable benefit, then also highlight the contents page for a TIPA, which is right at the start of the grey blob, the Act itself, because in the heat of the exam, sometimes you can just forget the section number, but you will hopefully be able to remember, oh, it's employees, it's a TIPA, and then if I just go into the contents page at the front, you can quickly, briefly look down and say, oh, right, yes, there it is, it's section whatever. So, you know, be prepared, have the contents page highlighted as well as statute itself. Sometimes the contents page can actually act as a sort of a memory jogger. For example, if we have a look at the contents page here for the Income Taxes Act, the bit that's got losses in it, you can see that here, with the main headings, we've got a sort of everything I need to know about losses. So use the loss against general income, use the loss as a capital gains tax loss, early trade loss relief, carry forward your loss, terminal loss relief. It's a sort of a memory jogger of all the different things you can do with the loss, which, of course, again, if you're going a bit blank in the exam, open up, all right, it's there, feeling comforted now I can talk about losses. I want to move on to now talking about how you will highlight in a way that's useful for you in the exam. So, for example, if we have a look at EIS relief, and here are the main conditions listed in front of you. So our shares are ordinary shares subscribed for in an unquoted trading company. The relief is 30% of the amount invested. There's a maximum and minimum investment, qualifying individual, conditions for shares, certain types of companies qualify, certain types of trade qualify. So there's lots and lots and lots of conditions going on here that you probably don't want to commit all of those to memory. So you're going to highlight the legislation. Now, EIS reduces your tax bill. So it's all to do with calculating the tax bill, so it's in the Income Taxes Act. It's actually in Part 5, as you can see here. And if we look at the contents of the Income Taxes Act, Section 180 onwards, we're starting to look at EIS. Now, what I mean about highlighting is I don't want to have to read everything. I only want the key words to jump out at me. So I don't want to be looking at this. I just want to see those keywords jumping out at me when it comes to highlighting. So this is in the content itself. And so in the content, I've nearly given myself a memory jogger by just highlighting the keywords: trading company, qualifying business activity, unquoted, gross assets, employees. Those are the main things to remind me of what the main conditions are. I can then go into legislation if I need even more detail and start highlighting that. Now again, here's Section 183. I don't want to be reading through all of Section 183 in the exam. I just haven't got the time. I want to have prepared 183 so that when I open it, I just see the key things. So qualifying business activity, relevant qualifying trade. What is a relevant qualifying trade? It's not excluded activities. What's excluded activities? Well, land, banking, leasing, property development, and so on. So can you see what I'm doing is I'm just highlighting the keywords so that when I open the legislation in the exam, all I can see are the keywords jumping out at me, and I don't have to plough through the whole of the section to work out what things I need to be mentioning in my model answer. And what you will find is that you're going to sit at home, you're going to prepare, 10, 20 different model answers like this, and hopefully, fingers crossed, one of them will turn up in the exam. But if it does, you're going to open up the legislation, and there is the model answer. What are the conditions for waiting for you to just copy them out because they're highlighted, the keywords are highlighted, and you're ready to go to write a nice, succinct answer in a very short time. Okay. Right, so, again, another example of this, the gross assets requirement. 15 million before, 16 million after. So again, I'm using the words in the legislation to help me with those conditions. It's just a matter of sitting back when you are studying and thinking to yourself, with the legislation open in front of you, okay, what are the key words that are going to help me form that perfect answer? If you remember earlier, I said there are lots of unusual hidden gems in the legislation, not just the main acts themselves. Let's have a look at some of these. We've got statements of practice. For example, D12 is all about partnership CGT, really useful. We've got purchase of own shares, long life assets, major change in the nature or conduct of a trade. So lots of interesting other stuff in there, and the other stuff, statements of practice and other things, tend to be written in a much nicer style, much easier to understand in the exam itself. Some of them have wonderful examples in there that you're more than happy to use in exam. Examiner would be really pleased to see that. What else have we got? We've got extra statutory concessions, things like something to do with the wear and tear allowance and rollover relief and restrictions on partnership losses. We've also got a really nice business brief on the new penalty as it then was for failure to notify, but it's written really nicely. And then we've got revenue interpretations as well. Whoops, let's go back to that one, a bit too fast there. So, for example, meaning of a trading company. I would suggest you have a look at these different hidden gems, as I've called them. Make sure you know where they are in the legislation in case you want to find them again in the exam itself. Now, miscellaneous section. This is actually my favourite. The miscellaneous section has all sorts of exciting things in it. In Tolley's, this is in part 2, obviously, because that's where all our statutory instruments and other material is, and it's the very last grey blob on the top as you stand the book up at the very top. Now, it's got IR35, fantastic. This was the booklet that was written for the members of the public to read, so really easy to understand. Lots of work examples on those personal service companies. What else have we got in there? We've also got HMRC 6. Now, can I just say, please take this on with a pinch of salt. It's all about overseas things. So it's got residence, ordinary residence, domicile. Well, as you know, residence and ordinarily residence has changed for our tax year. So that bit of HMRC 6 you want to just ignore. It's wrong. But the other stuff it's got in there, like domicile, the remittance basis charge, all sorts of things like mixed funds, etc., that's all still relevant. So this part of our miscellaneous section, be careful with some of it, but the rest of it is fantastically useful in the exam. We've got some stuff on anti-money laundering guidance, appeals. So that's basically our part 2. But then there's also some other hidden gems. For example, in the national insurance section of your legislation, there's a statutory instrument, and you can see it here, 2001/1004, Regulation 21 and 100 are your maxima calculations, so the maximum amount of NIC someone will pay in a year. In our VAT section, another hidden gem is Statutory Instrument 1995/2518. This is fabulous. This has got loads of information in it. For those of you sitting the awareness block of VAT, you'll be using this statutory instrument an awful lot to answer questions. Brilliant. Very, very useful if you can find it. So, there's the legislation. There's the hidden gems within the legislation, and we've talked a little bit about highlighting. What I'd like to talk about next is using the index. Now remember, there's 2 indexes, the main index and the noddy index. The main index comes first. The noddy index, as I call it, is after the main index. Always look up something in the noddy index first, because that's a simple one. If you can't find it in that index, then go into the main index itself. But I think you'll find the main index is not very, very helpful. and things are not necessarily where you might expect them to be. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's say I need to look up conditions for an EMI scheme. Now, I look it up in the main index. I look up Enterprise Management Incentive Scheme. It isn't there. Okay, so if I haven't got EMI, then what will I look up? So I have to think laterally. So I think, all right, EMI is a share scheme, a share incentive scheme. I'll look up share incentive schemes. No EMI there at all. So again, I have to think, okay, well, what sort of share scheme is it? It's a share option scheme. And then once I get to share option scheme, I will eventually find EMI. So it isn't amazingly useful. What would have been much easier for me is if I could think, all right, EMI, share scheme, employees, that's a TEPA, and then go to the contents of a TEPA, and then I would have eventually found my conditions for an EMI. Let me come back to highlighting again, and these are my golden rules for highlighting. The first is less is better than more. You can always add a little bit more highlighting at a later date, but you can't rub it out. You can't take it away. Something that makes me very nervous in the classroom is when students are sitting there with their books in front of them and talking, they've got their highlighter pen and they're just highlighting everything. And I'm going, no! Because, of course, that means you have to read everything in the real exam. And that sort of really makes highlighting pointless. So keep it short and snappy and neat. Think before you put the highlighter onto the paper. The study texts have a lot of words highlighted in bold. These are the key words. These really are the key words you want to be highlighting in the legislation. Always highlight the contents pages of an act as well, because in the heat of the exam, you may go blank and not remember the section number, but you're much more likely to remember the act. All right, I know it's a TOIA. I'll have a look down the contents at the front of a TOIA. Oh, right, yes, there it is. I've highlighted it. There's the section number I was looking for. Consider a highlight of the index if the act is not obvious to you. Consider using different colours to aid your highlighting, to aid your understanding of the legislation when you open the book. And I'll give you a few examples of that in a moment. And then finally, you cannot highlight everything. And I don't just mean block highlighting. What I mean is some things have to be committed to memory. The only thing you should be using the legislation for in the exam is to look up things that are really impossible to learn or very boring to learn. Things like definitions and conditions, that sort of thing. So let's have a look at how using colours can help you in your understanding of the legislation. So if we have a look at the Capital Allowances Act here, and we're looking at the definition of planned, what we've got here is Section 21 says that we have a building which is not planned. Section 22, we have structures which are not planned, but Section 23 are things that look like buildings and structures but are planned. So what I've done here is I've said red is bad, not planned, green is good, it's planned. And within the actual legislation itself, if you have a look at what I've done here, I said planned is not a building, and then we have a list of assets treated as buildings. And in 22, planned is not a structure, and then a list of assets which are structures. And then moving on to green, Section 23, Section 21 and 22 do not apply to these things here, so thermal insulation, integral features, and finally list C. So all these items here are in green, or the ones that I'm more likely to see in exam, like refrigeration, fire alarm systems, movable partition walls, decorative assets in a restaurant, that sort of thing. I've put those in green. Again, to remind myself, green is good, yes, 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 it's planned. Red is bad, it's not planned. So that's what I mean by using different colours. Another area you might think of using colours are, say, the contents pages of the TEPA. So here we're looking at taxable benefits. So red is taxable, green is not taxable. The taxable benefits, things like cash vouchers, living accommodation, expensive accommodation, cars, wristbands, accessories inside that car. Now, capital contributions, I've put that in yellow because it's something else. To make me realise it's something else. And a capital contribution towards the cost of the car comes off the list price of the car when you're working out that benefit. So it's just a reminder you have to do something with those capital contributions. Again, loans, taxable. Now we're on to exempt benefits, not taxable, green, so things like mileage allowances, travel and subsistence, work-related training, annual parties, well, up to a certain amount at least anyhow, certain living accommodation, i.e. job-related, workplace meals, childcare, phones, that sort of thing. So what I'm doing here is I'm using colour to help me quickly flick down through the contents page as a memory jogger to remind myself of what's taxable and what's exempt. You can also use colour to help you where the legislation is a little bit complicated. So the example I've chosen here is VAT on food. Now the legislation starts off by saying a supply of items set out in the general items below is zero rated except for some things here, so catering, and accepted items, but not the exceptions to the accepted items. So by now your head is reeling. You can't keep up with what's going on because it's this but that but not this. And so what I've decided to do is use colour highlighting to help me. So green is good, green is zero rated, red is not zero rated, hence standard rated. So I've got catering and accepted items are standard rated, they're in red, and down here I've got food is zero rated, it's in green. And then the accepted items, again, red, standard rated, naughty food, chocolate, potato crisps, we know we shouldn't eat, red, standard rated, whereas the exceptions to those are green, they're okay, tea, coffee, that sort of thing, zero rated. So what I've just sort of done is just taken the highlighter pen and sort of jigged the legislation in a way that I can now understand it when I quickly open it and have a look at it in front of me in the exam. And then I've carried on, so I've said catering, of course, red, standard rated, hot food, which is above ambient air temperature, again, standard rated. So use the legislation to help you understand the legislation, use the highlighting, I should say, to help you understand the legislation when you come to open the book, look at the legislation in the exam itself. Okay, so what's next? When to use the legislation? Well, not all the time. You will find that these exams are terribly time pressured. You cannot be looking everything up. It's impossible. You will not get through the first question alone if you have to look everything up. The fundamentals of all the taxes need to be known. I really wouldn't expect you to be using the legislation for short form questions at ATT and at awareness. Apart from the VAT section in awareness, you will hardly be using the legislation at all. You might use it to answer, say, one question in every block of 12. So you really won't be using the legislation then. You haven't got the time at all to do that. For longer questions, you might be using the legislation if it's asking you for conditions, definitions, etc. You will have to judge from the detail in the question and the time allocation how much detail you need to put in and hence take out of the legislation, write out into your model answer. Don't copy great big chunks of the legislation. Not really what the examiner wants to see, although you can copy out the legislation. You just don't want to see chunks and chunks and chunks. So that's why you want to sort of have it prepared that you're only going to copy out the bits that are relevant to the question that's been set. And be really careful when quoting the legislation if you are writing your answer to a client, because they just won't understand what's going on. It isn't something the examiner wants to see you doing. Let's have a look at this examiner comment about using the legislation. I've made mention in past reports for the need of answers really to be appropriate to the person you are writing them to. So if you are writing a letter to a client, you will not quote the legislation. You will avoid technical references. Those to a finance director, you can have a little bit more technical explanation, and then of course those to a tax partner should contain full references to the legislation and case law if you know it. Questions which simply require an explanation, not addressed to anyone in particular, again, full technical answer if you know it. What I would say to you is if you don't know the section number, please don't waste time to go off looking it up unless the question specifically says with reference to legislation. Because again, it's very time consuming to find section numbers. But if you know them, throw them in if it's to the appropriate person you are addressing your answer to. On the whole, candidates rarely quote statutory references. Candidates will score marks for quoting statutory references where appropriate, so in a memo to a tax partner rather than to a client. Given that this was an internal report for a senior manager, very few candidates use statutory references. The tone was also not always appropriate for the target. Our examiner really likes you to address your answer to the person you are speaking to. So if it's to a lay client, your answer should be written in a way that the lay client, the man in the street, can understand. So be careful with jargon and definitely do not quote statutory references or even case names. A large number of candidates scored good marks on this question, but marks could have been gained for identifying the correct statutory authority for the various tax treatments as required by the question. If the question asks you to say what the section number is, then please do try and mention as many section numbers as you can. This should have been easy marks for those who could find the relevant sections in the TIPA and put the rules into user-friendly English. Sadly, the majority merely copied out the legislation, which would not have been valued by the client, because, of course, it's too technical for a client. The client wants it in a language that they can understand. So, as we come to the end of the lecture, I just want to give you a little warning. The legislation gives you the rules, but it won't give you the answer or the advice, because you have to do that. And to do that, you have to understand the legislation. So that's why the legislation in the exam is there just as your conditions, your definitions, you know, saving you a little bit of brain power so that you can do other things with your brain, such as understand the legislation so that you can apply it to the question set and give the appropriate answer or advice. So, it doesn't matter which legislation you're using, there's lots of it, and I think you're probably all going to have to get yourselves a trolley bag because it weighs a ton. And of course we bring it all with us to the exam itself, even though you won't be using it that much. But of course it's a comfort blanket, and we feel we have to have it there. And who knows, it could save you bacon at the end of the day. Well, I do hope that you have found this lecture interesting and that it's been useful. If you have any questions whatsoever, do feel free to email us, and good luck with your studies.